It's very clear now that the responsibility for Alberta's COVID-19 crisis, in which dozens and dozens of people have died, rests with Premier Jason Kenney. Now, I interviewed Dr. James Talbot today, who used to be the Alberta Chief Medical Officer of Health. And he said, in his opinion, that Jason Kenney seems to be following the principles of the Great Barrington Declaration, which was essentially you protect the most vulnerable in your population, and then you let COVID-19 just run rampant. If that's the case, I'm kind of curious about what kind of political calculations led to that within the government and within the UCP caucus. So I'm going to talk to Professor Duane Bratt about that. So welcome to the interview, Duane.
Good afternoon, Markham.
Now, you and I did an interview last week, and we did talk about how Jason Kenney made his COVID-19 response is the direct result of political calculations. What kind of calculations was he making with respect to his caucus?
So it is clear that a significant element of his caucus do not want to see economic restrictions. They don't want to see any form of masking. They don't want to see mandatory vaccination. They want as light a touch as possible. And they're searching out evidence to conform with that belief structure. And so what they have discovered is this declaration that says, well, the way to get to herd immunity is just let the virus take its course, let it flow through the population, and then we'll come out on the other side. And yeah, some people will die, but people are going to die anyway. But this will make us better off with as few restrictions as possible. And the key thing is to protect people in long-term care facilities and the elderly. But everybody else, you know, if they want to get vaccinated, they can get vaccinated. If they don't want to get vaccinated, then they can get COVID. And if you're young, you'll survive. So they have an answer, and they're searching out a theory that will conform to that answer.
Now, when you say that a significant portion of the caucus holds those views, are we talking about 25%, 50%? Do we have any idea?
I think we've got some indications. So we do know from polling numbers that about 80% of Albertans support vaccine mandates, for example. And this has been consistent with polling we've seen throughout the pandemic, where about 80% wanted to see tougher restrictions. So you would think most politicians on an 80-20 question would go on the side of the 80, except that 80-20 isn't replicated within caucus. And there's 60 odd members of the caucus. I would say anywhere from 15 to 20 of them believe in as few restrictions as possible. Some of them may believe that COVID is a hoax, but more of them believe that the pain is worse than the disease, that the economic pain is worse than the disease. And the reason I can point to that number is we had about 17 MLAs in early April sign a public letter to the government complaining about COVID restrictions. So it's possible that there may be people who thought the same way, but were unwilling to put their name on the document, particularly if you're a cabinet minister, for example. So if you look at 17 out of 60, it's not that hard to say, well, if you throw in some cabinet ministers, you're probably looking at over 20, which is a third of the caucus. So I'll go with a third.
So walk us through what that means in terms of government dynamics. How does a significant portion of caucus and some cabinet ministers who were opposed to tougher measures, how does that impact Kenney's thinking? How does it impact how policy gets made?
Because much of what Kenney's objective is to keep his party united. The United Conservative Party was a major achievement on Kenney's behalf. It's his baby. He helped to force the merger. I think a merger might have come anyway, but not as quickly as it did without an architect like Jason Kenney. So here he is with a issue that is very divisive in that caucus. How do you keep those people together? Well, you keep it together with a series of compromises. So you wait weeks before bringing in a vaccine passport. You don't call it a vaccine passport. You call it a restrictions exemption program. And over again, we've seen these sorts of same compromises play itself out. So a decision is made at the sort of at the inner cabinet level, the COVID committee level, which has got the most senior members of cabinet. Then he has to sell that to the rest of cabinet. Then he actually has to go to caucus and sell it to the rest of caucus, because he's trying to keep people in the tent. I mean, Drew Barnes had been critical of all sorts of things that Jason Kenney did, including COVID, and he was kept in caucus until Todd Loewen, the Alberta caucus chair, explicitly called on the resignation of the premier. That was seen as a bridge too far, so they kicked Loewen out, and they thought, well, while we're at it, we'll kick out Drew Barnes too. Well, since that moment, since I would say September, we've had a number of backbenchers come out and basically say, I don't have confidence in the premier. Some, like Angela Pitt, who's on the anti-COVID restriction side, the anti-mask side, the anti-vax side, and then others like Leela here and Richard Godfrey on the you waited too long to act premier. So far, they have been kept in the tent. Some of them, like Leela here, were demoted from cabinet. Richard Godfrey stepped down as Calgary caucus chair. But the rest, he's desperately trying to keep them in the tent, because he believes that a divided Conservative Party means the NDP will be reelected. What he's failing to realize is that even a united Conservative Party that isn't properly acting on COVID is also not going to be reelected.
Now, over the course of history, Duane, we've seen issues break out that divide caucuses, both at the federal level and at the provincial level. I don't think that's particularly new. And sometimes the premiers, effect compromises to keep it, to keep everybody on the team together. And sometimes they have to step up and do what's right, in spite of the divisions. I don't know what I remember, and I do have a degree in Canadian history, so I think I remember some of this stuff. I don't remember these kinds of decisions being made that actually killed people.
Yeah, I mean, we've had caucus revolts, we've had people get kicked out. Probably one of the biggest revolts was the Bloc Québécois, when Lucien Bouchard and other members of Mulroney's government walked away and formed their own party over the Constitution. That was a pretty major moment. It brought down the PC government, not then, but in the 93 election. But that was on a point of principle. But to your point, no one died because of Beach Lake. No one died because of Charlottetown. But we are in a pandemic where we're approaching 3,000 dead in Alberta. The other is that the other revolts, besides the big one facing the Mulroney government, have usually been one person or two people, not as much as a third of your caucus. And particularly given how fragile this party is, how new this party is. It only merged officially in 2017. It's only been in government for 2.5 years. So I think that's part of it. And for Kenney, it may be seen now as great tactical brilliance to orchestrate that merger as quickly as he did. After all, the federal merger, it took over a decade. This took 2 years. But from a strategic point of view, maybe these two parties don't belong in the same room. Maybe there's so many fundamental differences between, let's say, the old Wild Rosers or the Progressive Conservatives that they're fundamentally incompatible. And I wonder, in a thought experiment, what life would have been like if Jason Kenney had revitalized the PC party, left the Wild Rosers alone, formed a majority government with, let's say, 49 to 50 seats, and the Wild Rosers still won a majority of the rural seats. How much different the policy response would have been. Because if he allows the UCP to break apart, he's admitting political failure.
Well, let's talk about for a moment something that doesn't enter into politics very often, and that's morality and ethics. At some point, Duane, is it not, can Albertans not look at the premier and say, Premier, this is a moral issue. People are dying, people are getting sick, children are getting sick, and that has to be more important than politics, or am I just being naive?
No, you're absolutely right. And that's how Albertans are treating this. The problem is the government isn't. And there aren't a whole lot of mechanisms to get rid of a government in the absence of an election. So he was able to wheel and deal within caucus to get a leadership review in April. Some have said, oh, that's too far away. Let's try it in March. Well, March, April, like what's the difference? And it is quite possible that Jason Kenney could win a leadership review within his party. Okay. Because he's a really good tactician in those black arcs of politics. But what does it say to all of the severely normal Albertans who are not party members, who are not part of the UCP, that have polling? We've got 3 sets of polls now that show Kenney's approval rating between 9 and 17%, 9 and 17. And then if he comes out with a confidence vote within his party, what does that say about the party? And I think that's what Albertans are looking at. They've already made up their mind. What they are is disappointed with the other members of caucus who can't make up their mind.
Final question, Duane. I'm going to ask you to haul out your crystal ball here. So we've got, roughly 7 months, 6-7 months before the leadership review. What's likely to happen between now and then?
I see a much more restrictive lockdown coming, either before Thanksgiving or soon after Thanksgiving. And I say that for a couple of reasons. One is obviously the hospitalizations, the ICUs, the deaths are continuing. Whether you're talking about, Kenney said on last week, we're plateauing at about 1,000 hospitalizations. Well, 1,000 is a lot. We're dealing with anywhere from 15 to 30 deaths per day. That's a lot. That is going to force your hand. The other is that he has said for a couple of weeks now, we will not do a lockdown. Well, the pattern has been the government digs in its heels. It's advised to do something. It says that it won't. And then 3 weeks too late, they respond with the same policy. And finally, last week's press conference, Kenney said Thanksgiving is going to be a spreader event and October is going to be worse than September. Over 300 people died in the month of September. That is horrifying. And so the question is, if you know Thanksgiving is going to be a spreader event, October is going to be worse than September, shouldn't you be doing something now? So that is one prediction I think is going to come true, whether that involves kids staying home from school, remote delivery at universities, maybe banning in-house dining and back to takeout again. Maybe we drop the capacity levels at the Flames games or the Stampeders games. But I think that's definitely coming. The question is when.
Actually, Duane, I do have a final question for you. And that is, have you ever in the history of Canadian politics seen a government and a premier this disorganized and this out of control, lack of control, lack of direction, lack of will, lack of resolve in the face of a crisis?
Yeah, even the Bennett government in the early parts of the Depression were dealing with an unprecedented economic collapse, and they simply didn't have the levers and the mechanisms to do so. That would be an illustration. But in this case, we're dealing with now the 4th wave. The first wave, the Alberta government actually handled quite well and hasn't replicated that same strategy since. We're dealing with a situation at a national level of the same national forces at play with a differential response province by province. And the 2 outliers are Alberta and Saskatchewan. Alberta has led the way in not responding, and poor Saskatchewan is just following Alberta's lead. So I can't see another parallel to what this is going through. There have been mistakes about policy, but these are life and death issues. I haven't seen polling numbers this bad. I mean, at best, you're talking the teens, supporting the teens on a scale of 100. I don't know how much longer we can deal with this, but obviously Kenney feels that he can pull some rabbit out of the hat as far as his own party is concerned, even if the rest of the province remains mired in this health struggle.
and even if the province pays the price for those political calculations. Well, Duane, thank you very much for this. Appreciate your insights.
Okay, Markham.